Good morning. My name is Tess Thorman, and I'm a research associate at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings from PPIC's report, Assets, Debts, and Wealth in California. The report, technical appendices, policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can be found on our website at ppic.org. This research and event are supported with funding from the Blue Shield of California Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation. We'd like to thank them for their support. For today's program, I will present some of the key findings from the report. I will then invite my co-author and colleague, Shannon McConville, to join me to answer questions from our virtual audience. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And now on to the presentation. So as I mentioned, today I'll be providing a brief overview of the findings from this report, but there's much more detail in the full report, and I would just encourage those who are interested in specific numbers to look at the report or the technical appendix for any numbers that we don't discuss today. Now, why study wealth? So as a term, wealth is often really evocative of the idea of having considerable resources. However, it just refers to what you own minus what you owe. And it's really key to economic security and mobility for everyone. In that the benefit of having wealth is that it provides you with the ability to weather changes in income, to cover sudden expenses. It also makes it possible for us to invest in future opportunities, whether that's starting a business or paying for college, for example. Now, Californians are really keenly aware of the barriers to building up assets in the state, including, this understanding that costs of living are high in California, which makes it really hard to set aside money. And Californians are pretty aware of how large the gap there is between households with a lot of wealth and households with only a little. Despite this, pretty little research has explored net worth at the state level in California, largely for data reasons. So we tend to focus instead on household income. However, these are separate concepts. So income is a flow. It's something that we might think of what you bring in over the course of a month or a year, usually for most households from earnings or from Social Security. And it's what we use to meet our day-to-day needs. That's why we look at income to measure poverty or whether people have enough to meet their basic needs. By comparison, wealth, as I mentioned, captures what you own minus what you owe, and it does that at a single point in time. So in this report, we're going to provide some basic facts about wealth for California households using data from the 2022 U.S. Census Bureau Survey on Income and Program Participation. And we'll do that by looking at those categories of what you own, or assets, and what you owe, or debts. We also look in the report at the distribution of wealth across households and across household characteristics. And then we give some examples of state and local policies in California that aim to help California households build wealth. This is kind of a roadmap of what we're going to look at today, and the key findings from the report, which are that California households typically have more wealth than do those in the rest of the country. We find that home equity and retirement accounts are typically the highest value assets that households have, and education debt is the largest debt that most households hold that's not related to something tangible like a house or a car. We also find that assets, debts, and wealth vary pretty substantially across households, both across characteristics and between those with substantial wealth and those with very little. And we see a really large gap between the amount of wealth that those near the top and near the bottom of the distribution have. Turning to this first finding, that California households have more wealth than do those in other states. We estimate that median net worth in California is about $288,000 compared to $180,000 elsewhere, and that typically assets are around $494,000 in California versus $311,000 in the rest of the country. The third set of columns on the right, however, shows you that debts tend to be larger in California as well. So among the 75% of California households that owe any money, we estimate that at the median, that's around $103,000 versus in the rest of the country, households with some debt typically have about $74,000 in debt. One of the things that we think this is really reflective of is the high value of real estate in California, both in terms of, when we look at assets being higher, that those real estate values are higher, but also that people need to borrow more money in order to buy homes. And that's like within this broad context of California's particularly high cost of living. Bank accounts and vehicle equity tend to be the most common assets in California and elsewhere. So we estimate that 95% of California households have a checking or savings account, and about 82% have some vehicle equity. The next two sets of columns you'll see are home equity and retirement accounts. These are less common in California and also elsewhere, but you'll notice that in particular, California households are less likely to have home equity. We estimate around half of California households have some home equity compared to around 63% of households in the rest of the country. Retirement accounts are more similar at about 60% in California and elsewhere. Other types of assets that aren't shown here are less common. So around a third of California households have financial investments outside of retirement accounts. About 16% have some business equity and 10% have rental properties. Even though we see that checking and savings accounts and vehicle equity are the most common assets to have, we find that home equity and retirement accounts have the highest values. And even though lower shares of California households have home equity than do those in other states, homeowners in California have more in home equity than homeowners in other states. So we're estimating around $484,000 compared to $178,000 in home equity for homeowners elsewhere. It's also true that for Californians, home equity makes up a much higher share of their net worth if they're homeowners. So California homeowners have around 56% of their net worth coming from that home equity versus homeowners in other states having around 44% coming from home equity. Another way of thinking about this is that for most households, home equity is really where people hold the lion's share of their wealth. When we look just at California households, we find that asset portfolios tend to vary across groups. And here I'm just showing home equity and retirement accounts as an example, since those are typically the largest one. As I mentioned before, there's more detail in the report and technical appendix. One thing that you'll notice first here, we look at age, we look at education and race ethnicity for these, for looking at these asset types. Economists typically think about asset building over the life cycle, where people are typically building up assets, seeing them grow in value over time, and then drawing them down in retirement. Home equity tends to be most common among older households. It's valued highest at that point. Other assets tend to be most common among households where the head is between 35 and 64. Looking down at the bottom, you'll see we also find pretty large gaps across racial and ethnic groups. We see that white and Asian households typically have more and higher value assets than Latino and Black and other households. This is reflective of a lot of things, including well-known income gaps, but also a history of policy and practices. I'll just note here, we're showing these differences separately across groups, but the reality is that each of these factors interacts in ways that also impact wealth levels. One example of this is that Latino households in California tend to be younger and are less likely to include college degree holders. And both of those things are associated, as you can see here, with lower home ownership. We find that those factors actually explain a lot of the gap in home ownership between Latino and white and Asian households. And that suggests that as the state's Latino population ages, and if educational attainment increases, that gap could decrease. But we don't find the same thing to be true for Black households, which is even at similar ages, incomes, and education levels, Black households in California are less likely to own homes. I'll turn now to debt, which plays a really important role in wealth for Californians because it can be a means of affording something or investing in something when you don't have cash up front, but it can also make it harder to save. We tend to describe debt as good when it can pay off over the long term and bad when it leaves you paying more than the ticket price in interest for something that doesn't grow in value. I pointed out at the beginning that around 75% of households in California have some debt. What we're showing here is that about half of households have some debt that's not tied to collateral like a house or a car. And credit card debt tends to be the most common type of that unsecured debt. Around 40% of households have some credit card debt in California. That's followed by education debt and then medical or other unsecured debt. You'll notice that medical and other debt is less common in California than it is elsewhere. Still, about 1 in 10 California adults report struggling to afford the costs of medical care for themselves or their family in the last 12 months. Even though we've seen credit card debt as the most common type of unsecured debt, we find that education debt or student loan debt is typically the largest value debt. Among the 17% of California households who have any student loan debt, the typical value is around $23,000 in California. Now, type of debt also varies across households, similar to how we saw differences across type of assets. As I talked before about that kind of life cycle perspective on asset building, we see a similar thing for debt where um, older households are broadly less likely to hold all kinds of unsecured debt, having had time to build up savings and pay down existing debt. You'll notice here when we look at educational attainment by households, we don't see huge differences in the first two categories of unsecured debt and credit card debt, but probably unsurprisingly, we see that households where someone has a four-year degree or more are much more likely than those where nobody does to have some outstanding student loan debt. In terms of race ethnicity, we see that white and Asian households are generally less likely than Latino and Black and other households to hold unsecured debt. And Latino households in particular are more likely to hold credit card debt, and Latino and Black households are more likely to hold education debt, which is true even once we account for differences in income and other household characteristics. We take now a kind of zoom out to look at wealth overall, and we find a really wide gap between high and low wealth levels in California, where specifically households near the top of the wealth distribution have more than 100 times as much wealth as those near the bottom of the wealth distribution. By kind of comparison, when we look at the income distribution, households at that same high point for income have just 4 times the annual income of those with income at that same low point in the income distribution. And I just want to highlight that when we look at this for wealth, it's not only a big relative difference between top and bottom, but households near the bottom of the wealth distribution have little or nothing in net worth. And we actually find that about 7% of households in California owe more than the value of their assets, meaning they have negative net worth. This has some really big implications for whether people can kind of access that buffer function of wealth, where we estimate that only about 6 in 10 California households has enough saved up in liquid assets to meet their basic needs if they had a few months without income. Now, we don't in this report look at changes in wealth gaps over time in California, but we know from national research that wealth inequality has been growing and that what it's driven by is something that's really similar to what we see for income inequality in California, which is that the middle and bottom levels of wealth have really not changed over time, but we've seen really substantial growth at top levels of wealth. And that's kind of what's driving the growth in the gap between top and bottom nationally. This is all concerning because researchers found that high levels of economic inequality overall are associated with reduced economic activity, with reduced economic mobility, and also less political participation. When we take that overall look to look at median net worth across some of the groups that we've been looking at asset differences and debt differences for, we see again some similar patterns, which is that older, college-educated, and white and Asian households tend to have higher median net worth than do others. And one thing to kind of just note on this figure is that the wealth of older households really underscores the significance of demographic shift in California. And I think it's been much remarked upon that we are approaching this largest generational transfer of wealth from baby boomers to their children. Now, in closing, I want to turn to the role that government in California currently plays in supporting wealth building, since there are a variety of policies and programs at kind of the state and local levels that aim to help Californians build assets and manage debts. And we kind of put these into 5 broad categories and then give examples of each of them rather than coming up with an exhaustive list. But the way that we think about these are there's financial assistance for first-time homebuyers, programs to encourage and seed savings accounts, whether that's aimed towards retirement savings or building up savings in childhood for college. California has focused on increasing financial literacy, for example, with adding a high school graduation requirement to have taken a personal finance course. Expanding access to credit is another really important one, whether, some examples include managing what gets reported to credit bureaus, for example, proactively reporting on-time rent payments, but also things like small business supports and helping small businesses to access credit to start or grow their businesses. And then finally, we've seen efforts in the area of reducing unsecured debt, which could look like supports to help repay student loans, but also medical debt forgiveness. Now, broadly, we find that many of these approaches are backed by some evidence that they have effects on their direct goals. But we would recommend future research or further research on most of these, both to understand whether those impacts are causal, but also to understand how they build household wealth or how they impact household wealth over the long term, as opposed to simply their specific goals. And for Californians and policymakers, looking at the variety in even this short list is a reminder that of how many different ways there are to build wealth, and for policy to make sure that the benefits of wealth are broadly accessible. So at this point, I'm going to turn to the question and answer portion of our program, and I'd like to welcome my colleague and co-author of this report, research fellow Shannon McConville, to join for this portion. Just as a reminder, you can still submit some of your questions to the address on screen, which is PPIC event questions at gmail.com.
Thanks so much, Tess. That was such a great overview, and you covered so much of the ground in what we presented and analyzed in the report. As I think about why wealth feels important to so many Californians, it really does seem to increase. The need for wealth feels like it increases as we get older. And as you mentioned, we know that there's going to be a large growth in the older adult population. And so thinking about ways that California policy can support kind of the security of older adults is really important. And retirement accounts, you showed about 60% of households have retirement accounts of some sort. And oftentimes these are employer benefits. We get these through our jobs, and in some cases, maybe your employer even contributes some money, and individuals are able to contribute their pre-tax income and really start building that up as they're working. But unfortunately, some people don't have access to those employer benefits depending on who their employer is or what type of job they have. And California policymakers did respond to that. They've created I think in 2016, the CalSavers program, where employers who do not offer some sort of retirement account savings are required to participate. And as of recently, there are more than 500,000 Californians who have retirement accounts through CalSavers, and about 50,000 employers are participating. So that seems, that's one of those specific ways that state policy has really tried to step in and be able to help people build these retirement accounts as for when they get older. But let's see, looks like we have a question from an audience member in San Francisco. Why is it important to study wealth in addition to income and poverty, and how correlated are income and wealth in California?
Yeah, I can start with this one. I think this is such an important question. It really speaks to why we did this report to begin with, which is that we often talk about these two things together because for most of us, they're really intertwined in our regular financial lives. But we primarily know about income in California, and it gives us a much bigger picture of the resources that California households have when we look at wealth as well. They perform super different functions in our day-to-day life. We think about income as something coming from a paycheck. It's what you use for your daily needs, whereas wealth is more about what's in your bank account and the value of your other assets, something that you can draw on to make those investments in the future. I think, we often think of income as the precursor to wealth, which is super important to establishing financial security, and saving up earnings is key to asset building. But there's kind of two things to think about here, which is that California's high cost of living make it hard, even at what we would think about as kind of a mid-range income, to set aside money to save. The other thing is that most wealth actually grows from assets kind of passively accruing in value. So even though being able to save income is really important, that's not where the bulk of wealth growth comes from in California or in the US. And there was another piece in this question about how those two things are related. it's not a one-to-one relationship. So what we find is that households that have really low incomes have much less wealth than they do income. And at the top end, households with high incomes have much more wealth than they do income. So not a one-to-one relationship, and we think it's really important to the extent that we're able to get a fuller picture of economic resources for households. But is there anything you wanted to add to that, Shannon?
I don't think so. I think you covered that really well. Um, we have another question, a viewer in Sacramento. What do we know and not know about the top of the wealth distribution? And how much of changes at the top affected the widening wealth gap we're seeing in the data?
hmm Yeah, okay, I can start with this one. A really challenging thing about the data we have available on wealth is that we don't know as much about the top in California as we would like, despite knowing, for example, that California has more billionaires than any other state. We understand that the top of the wealth distribution is really high, but we aren't able to get that same level of data that we can get at the national level on wealth in California. So that's why we end up showing the ratio between wealth at the 80th percentile and the 20th percentile in this report, instead of what we usually would do for income to look at 90th versus 10th. What that means is that this like 100 to 1 or more than 100 to 1 number is certainly a low version of how wide that gap is when we usually think about inequality. It would be great to have a better understanding of kind of the share of wealth that maybe the bottom half of the distribution has, and like that top 1% or 0.1%, for kind of privacy reasons and the size of the surveys that we have available publicly. We're not able to get into that level of detail. Um, and
Those
I
are
think, oh yeah, go ahead, Shannon.
I was just going to say, you pointed to the national data, and so, the Federal Reserve has done decades of work on wealth because it is this really important way that we understand economic security in the United States and throughout the world. But they have much better data and are able to capture that very top, and it shows what you've just said. The top 1% nationally, according to the most recent statistics. Have about more than a quarter of total wealth is held by this top 0.1 or top 1%. And the top 10% of the distribution has like 65% of all of the wealth, while the bottom 50% has only about 3% of total wealth. So it really underscores kind of this wide gap. And while we don't know about it in California, it certainly is, quite wide as well, because we do know we have so many people at that very top of the distribution.
hmm we have another question here from someone in Los Angeles who asks, how much wealth do we think households should have at a minimum? And how many households have that much saved up?
It's a really good question. And, you mentioned when we think about income, we have things, poverty thresholds. And these are, trying to get at some measure of what's the minimum amount to cover, say, your basic needs, things like housing, things like food. But we really only do that for your income, right? So if your income falls below a level, you're considered to be kind of under this poverty threshold, and then may have access to, say, safety net benefits to help you, secure some of those things that we want you to have. Wealth doesn't have any sort of similar kind of minimum or some amount that you should have. Sometimes we think about, or, as you're planning at your household, people will often think about maybe an emergency fund. This is where, you would have enough money to cover if your income dropped unexpectedly. Do you have enough money to cover, say, 1 month of, say, again, your basic needs like housing and things? We did look at that using the California Poverty Measure. And again, this is just a measure of like kind of the minimum amount you would need to cover your basic needs. We found about 70% of households have 1 month, could cover 1 month, and about 60% could cover 3 months of, meeting their basic needs if their income really dropped quite low. There were differences, not surprisingly, across groups in the same way that mirror kind of the differences that you already showed in net worth. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. I think this one maybe is also a good question for you, which is this viewer in Oakland asks, I noticed when you talk about racial wealth gaps, you grouped Black Californians in a category with other households. How big is the Black-white racial wealth gap without including that other group?
Again, we we don't really know, and this data that we use don't really allow us to do that because the sample sizes for just households headed by Black Californians is too small, and so any estimates that we can measure have kind of a really wide margin of error, so it's difficult to tell. The national data again do show very large gaps between Black and white households, and other research has suggested that that's reflective of past policies and discrimination against Black households in California. I think it's important. Other states, for example, Massachusetts, are doing a state level survey where they're really gathering additional information and kind of having better data resources to answer these kinds of questions. And so if California wanted to think about that, it would, likely require a fairly big investment, but to run a state level survey and make sure that again your samples are large enough that we can kind of disaggregate by these groups, and that becomes important, especially if we're creating policies that we're trying to address certain gaps in wealth, in order to just measure progress. It's a very good question.
Mhm. I think we probably have time for one more question here. This person in Sacramento asked what policies we think are most effective at increasing wealth. And I can start with this one. I think, we in this report really didn't do an analysis comparing policies on their effectiveness at helping Californians build wealth. Instead, we were kind of aiming to do some level setting on what options the state and local governments already take. In reality, we know that there probably isn't one best way to help families grow wealth. And that's, because there are so many different pathways to building up assets, to managing debts. This is a really personal experience. It's also true, like, I think a helpful frame I've seen from other researchers is to consider that you need to have financial stability first before you can build up wealth. And then you have to be able to accrue and buy assets. And then you have to be able to keep those assets. So this is like all of these points along the pipeline that policy could potentially intervene that are, relevant to different financial circumstances. And that is really reflected in the variety that we see in what the state is already doing. Um, I think a good example of this is home ownership. We know that for kind of the middle of the wealth distribution, it's 70 to 85% of the wealth that these households hold. It's so policies that help increase home ownership have a potentially really large contribution to make. At the same time, we know that the returns to homeownership are not the same across groups, and it's just not guaranteed to build wealth for everyone. With one example being that low-income households, are much more likely to need to pull equity out of a home in order to kind of meet near-term needs. So all this to say that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. I'll just note, in this report, we're really focused on what happens at the state and local level, but there's certainly a variety of policy happening at the federal level that can help impact and build wealth. Now, I think that we are reaching the end of our time for this program today. So I want to thank Shannon for joining me in today's discussion. I also want to thank our funders, the Blue Shield of California Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation. And thanks to all of you for joining us online. We would appreciate you taking a moment to give us your feedback on this event. So if you pre-registered for the event, you'll receive an email later today with a short survey. You can also scan the QR code on the screen right now. And then finally, a recording of today's event will be available on the PPIC website and our YouTube channel soon, so you can watch it again or share it with your network. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.